Hello and welcome again to another episode of Pack Wrap. Sorry about my arm and shot there, just getting the credits set up for us. And yeah, today, as you see, we have a very large stack of comics laid out before us. And what I figured we'd talk about today is one of my favorite long-running serials from originally Marvel. And the purpose of this video is discussing when properties change hands. So this is something that was actually really common back in the day when comics were first getting started in the early 30s and moving into the 40s and 50s. There were a lot of different publishing houses that popped up. It was a new industry, lots of new people, and everybody was trying to make their mark and make their dollar. And as time wore on, as I'm sure anyone watching this knows, we ended up with the big two, DC and Marvel. And through that period of time between now and the 30s, a lot of different studios got cannibalized. Something that a lot of people may not realize is that there's still a lot of other big publishing houses out there. The only ones that ever seem to get any media attention are Marvel and DC, but I'm pretty sure that everybody's seen an Archie comic if they've walked through the aisles of a grocery store. And there's other publishers that, if you're into comics, you absolutely know the logos of. There's Dark Horse, there's Image, to a lesser extent Top Cow. You've seen imprints like Vertigo and Wildstorm, different things like that. And whereas there was a lot of cannibalization back in the 40s and 50s, as everything was consolidated down into the bigger comic publishing houses, and a lot of different properties changed hands back in those days, most noticeably being the weird and harried story of Captain Marvel. Originally being Shazam, and then them letting the property lapse, and, all the nonsense that goes with that. That's not what this video is about. But in the late 90s and early 2000s, this cannibalization happened again, but somewhat in reverse. Marvel and DC let a bunch of their titles lapse, and they let a lot of their properties that they felt were less profitable go, or they just got in rights disputes with the owners of the property, like the case was with Hasbro. Actually, don't quote me on that. I am not sure if there was any animosity between Marvel and Hasbro. I know that the license lapsed. And the fact that Marvel was in a tight spot at the time, Hasbro took it somewhere else. So, one of my favorite titles from back in that era was G.I. Joe, because I'm absolutely a child of the 80s and a product of the marketing in that era. And I loved that in the early 90s, Marvel put a lot of effort into this property. They had fantastic artists working on it. They put in full effort to tie it in with Hasbro's toy line. This was a fantastic comic for its age. Mid-90s, just before everything kind of collapsed for Marvel, they took a huge shift. They went from it just being G.I. Joe to focusing very heavily on the culturally appropriated Ninja Force. And some of the very popular characters in that franchise. So you notice everything says Snake Eyes and the Ninja Force, or Snake Eyes and Scarlet Snake Eyes, despite it showing, obviously other characters. Another Hasbro property that tied in very, very much to those comics is the Transformers. So they did a lot of crossovers. Not just, in the 90s, but, you had crossovers of G.I. Joe and the Transformers back in the 80s. Some of my older editions of Marvel's Hasbro titles show that they had their own in-brand universe, we'll call it. And with all of these comics, I got really invested in the storylines in these. So imagine my disappointment as a teenager when after these great stories written by good authors, good artists, at least in a storytelling sense. I'm not going to talk on the morality of them. So these end, and then that property has to go somewhere else. Now, before I go too much further into this video, I do want to put a plug in real quick. I wanted to get started. But I'm doing a giveaway. My wife's company, Stitch Witch, has been making some geeky scrunchies. So any of you funny fans that have long hair, at some point during this video, a code is going to come up on screen. Not like special effect wise, it's going to be on something in here. There's going to be a code. And if you find that code and put it in the comments, one lucky funny fan will get contacted, and we will get things arranged to have this shipped to you for free. So if you want the awesome Spider-Man scrunchie, look for the code. And that's from Stitch Witch. If you look Stitch Witch up on Facebook, make sure it's the one with all the super geeky paraphernalia, like Spider-Man scrunchies and cool Pokemon plushes and or handmade Pokemon plushes and different things like that. So jumping back into this before I get too far segued and distracted. G.I. Joe was then picked up by Image. And Image had an imprint that was called Devil's Due Press. If you flip open this issue from Image of G.I. Joe, see Devil's Due right there. So Devil's Due was the one who got the license for this, published under the Image brand. And then, in 2002 or 3, somewhere in there, the Devil's Due Publishing broke away from Image and became their own independent thing. So you've got Marvel's label on G.I. Joe. You've got Image's label on G.I. Joe. You've got Devil's Due Press, their label on G.I. Joe. And as you can see, they did a lot with the property. I just have a few issues just in hand, but they have, you know, G.I. Joe Master and Apprentice, G.I. Joe Storm Shield, Storm Shadow, and they have G.I. Joe Snake Eyes Declassified. As you can see, it's kind of a theme to go with, you know, the Ninja Force. People really in the U.S. really liked the Ninja Force, despite them being American heroes. And then we pick up with Devil's Due Press losing the license in 2008, where it was then picked up, I think, in 2011 by IDW, which is where you're going to see a lot of these stories coming to an end. That IDW is kind of the place where good comics go to be reborn. And there have been some branding changes for IDW, but they picked up G.I. Joe as one of their earliest titles and started reworking it. Now, this is where I get into beef and issue with these constant buyouts or these constant transfers of the comics license for some of these properties, because Devil's Due Press tried to continue the Marvel storyline, jumping forward a few years in world timeline. When IDW got their hands on it, they didn't like what Devil's Due Press had done. So, but they enjoyed the Marvel comics, which I told you were well written for 90s comics and had good art and good people working on them in terms of their skills. So it was a high quality product. So IDW, rather than work with what they, I'm guessing, thought was I don't want to say subpar, but I think they felt that it didn't go the way that fans wanted to with Devil's Due Press. So IDW rebooted all the way back to the end of the Marvel run. So now you have two forked variations where you have to decide, and you've now possibly divided the fan base. And so IDW's G.I. Joe is the same as Marvel's G.I. Joe, but it's not the same as Devil's Due Press G.I. Joe. Not press, publishing. Gosh, I gotta get my phrases right. And IDW also acquired the Transformers rights and pretty much all of Hasbro's properties. They publish the My Little Pony comics, though that one's not as much of an issue. Like, there wasn't as much of a coherent storyline between all the different companies that published My Little Pony comics, because girls' toy franchises tend to be neglected when it comes to comic interactions. They tend to be more short one-off episodes and no grand overarching storylines or anything like that. But IDW got their hands on Transformers as well. They did the movie adaptions, they did their own independent stuff, and that's all dandy and well. Another story that works kind of in reverse. Dark Horse Comics, while Lucasfilms was its own banner, had a lot of Star Wars titles that they ran, and they covered a lot of the backstory of Star Wars. A lot of the things that we got as canon in the prequel movies, and things before that, like the Clone Wars and the End of the Republic, all of that was fleshed out years before in Dark Horse's Star Wars comics. And this points to the problem too that I mentioned, where when someone new gets the license, they just wipe the slate clean. So everything that you invested your time and your collection into, it's suddenly gone in terms of story. None of that progresses. None of that gets fleshed out anymore. So you had all of the Dark Horse comics. I only have this one here to show. I wasn't able to find the rest from my collection. But Dark Horse did a lot of Star Wars. And then, as you know, Disney acquired Star Wars. Disney acquired Marvel. So who's going to publish Star Wars comics now? It's not going to be Dark Horse. So Marvel gets it, and Disney makes the announcement that they're wiping the slate clean. Everything about the Dark Horse comics is uncanonized. It's completely wiped clean. None of that matters, and they rewrite all of the stories. So now you have an entirely different set of comics set in the same property that have nothing to do with the stuff that was previous. And we're talking that's well over, I believe, 2 decades. I think Dark Horse had the license for a good, 15, 20 years. And now we have to go back and start again with all these different stories from Marvel, and none of them interlink. They don't really use anything from the Dark Horse comics. Nothing from this world goes into this world. So if you're a vested fan of the comics, it can be kind of a pain. Now this one is less so, but it's another story of property hopping. Games Workshop likes to produce comics, and they have a lot of comic writers that join their staff for a time to write books for the Black Library website. The way I say that, Black Library is a site where you can buy books. If you're not familiar with it, it is not like a digital publishing platform, though it is. Any of the books you can get in physical copy there, you can also get in digital format. But it's not like it's Amazon where they're writing fan fiction and publishing it. It's a legitimate bookstore. It's just online. And they have shopped out their license to a lot of different comic companies over time. As you can see here, I've got 2 from Boom. I also know in my collection there is a title from Titan that was actually released as a freebie in an issue of White Dwarf not that long ago. I mean, we're not talking a decade ago. We're talking 3, maybe 4 years ago. And then, just recently, they've shopped their license over to Marvel. And so now Marvel is has done the Sisters of Battle series. They've done the Marnius Calgar series. And all of this, it's different tonally. It's different art-wise. Everything gets switched up and gets changed each time this license gets shipped around. The benefit, though, that Warhammer has is that though the license has been shopped around, the company that controls the license is more vested. So this is kind of a switch of how things are done in terms of how the license is handled. This is better, in my opinion, because Games Workshop cares about keeping the canon of their stories loosely together. So the stuff put out by Marvel, whereas it may be tonally different, artistically different, and may contradict at times stuff published by other publishers, the way that they have structured all of their content, both published by them and published by other publishers like Marvel and Boom and Titan, it all can loosely be gathered together as official content. So rather than being like super strict about details, the comics and things actually are just way more loose and tell individual stories about individual battlefields in a massive galaxy-spanning war. And that makes it a little bit easier to palate when they shift from publisher to publisher. And that's what I wanted to finish on, as a positive note on this. That there are options when shopping this license around can be good, it can work, and it produces something that fans will enjoy. I'm really not certain that any die-hard Warhammer fan that's die-hard enough they're buying comics really cares who the publisher is, because they know generally the storyline and where it's coming from. They know if it's a Sisters of Battle, like if it's the Sisters of the Bloody Rose, then it's gonna fit into that thematically. And it doesn't really matter because, you know, there are so many characters in that universe that it's just another set of characters. And if they're popular enough, they might get more stories. If not, then there will be more stories just with different characters. You know, with the exception being like Marneus Calgar, where this is obviously an attempt to flesh out his lore more, but once again, Games Workshop is very loose about how their lores apply. They've even created a narrator in their story that is several hundreds, possibly thousands of years in the future of when all of the stuff that you're reading about or doing is taking place. And he makes mention several times through official works of Games Workshop that he is getting it from multiple secondary accounts. Like, this was heard by a friend of a friend of a friend, which automatically writes into the narrative the possibility that this isn't the official story, the other one's the official story, but they can both be official. And so it works out, I think, better than some of the jarring shift that the other series have. And, you know, it's nice to see that someone cares enough about these titles to keep them running, and that the fandom is strong enough that they do continue to publish these things by shopping out the license to someone else. I just wish a little more care was taken sometimes. Like with G.I. Joe, to try and work in the stuff that was already there so that it didn't all just get discarded like Devil's Due Press, their stuff did. And I hope that companies like IDW continue to do things like salvage dead properties. They've done things like they've revived the Ghostbusters. They've done Magic the Gathering comics through Hasbro as well. They've done the Ninja Turtles. They've revived the Ninja Turtles, and they returned it to Laird. I don't think Eastman is involved anymore. But they got one of the original two guys to come back in and work on his comic again after the license had been taken away from him. And the fact that this helps sometimes smaller publishers to have something that has an established fan base so that they can build off of that is nice. It's also nice sometimes when you see something that is smaller that didn't work under that publisher for whatever reason, financially or logistically, to be picked up by someone bigger and then turned into something cool. So I just wanted to make my statements on the idea of shopping these properties around And I hope that you guys enjoy this slight little rant about how they kept changing my G.I. Joe comics and how that, affected me growing up. As you can tell, I'm still just a little bit bitter about Snake Eyes and the Ninja Force getting canceled when I was in my prime and formative years. Alright, so, for all of you who have been patiently looking for where that code is, ta-da! I don't know if you can really see that. I'm on a tiny screen recording this, so I can't see it. So I'm just going to go like this. Boop. Bam. There we go. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I will catch all of you later, and good night.